So it's my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Evan Fraser. And Dr. Fraser completed his PhD and his postdoctoral research at the University of British Columbia. And I did hear, speaking to him today, he actually did his undergraduate studying here at University of Toronto and actually worked in forestry, and in the summer actually cleaned up and did the tree inventory around the Fitzgerald building in this quadrant of the campus, and actually cleaned our walkways in the wintertime. So he has a long history with the Fitzgerald building in this part of U of T. But he then went on to do working at the University of Leeds in the UK from 2003 to 2010. He is currently the director of the Arrell Food Institute and a professor of geography, and holds a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security at the University of Guelph. He is also a fellow of the Trudeau Foundation, the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and an elected member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars. His work is on the challenges to food security over the next 2 generations, during which time population growth and climate change threaten to make food harder to produce and more expensive to buy. He has worked extensively with climate modelers, economists, ecologists, anthropologists, and journalists to explore possible solutions to this global challenge. During his career, he has played a leadership role in securing over $1 million in funding for topics related to food, agriculture, technology, and sustainability, including being the scientific lead of the University of Guelph's Food from Thought initiative, a $76 million grant from Canada's first Research Excellence Fund. In addition to over 90 scientific academic articles and book chapters, Dr. Fraser has written 2 popular books on food and sustainable agriculture, and has had articles published by CNN, The Guardian, Foreign Affairs.com, The Ottawa Citizen, and The Walrus. His web video series on Feeding 9 Billion has been watched over 350,000 times, and he has self-published a graphic novel called The Food Crisis, about fictitious food crisis that hits North America in the 2020s. Dr. Fraser has also created a card game about global food security. The videos, the graphic novel, and the card game have been pulled together in a series of teacher-friendly high school student lesson plans that are used in classrooms around the world. So you can see not only is Dr. Fraser an eminent scholar and researcher and scientist, he's actually really learnt what CHR is now calling knowledge translation, but he's actually been living it for the last number of years. So we're absolutely thrilled and delighted to have him here tonight to speak to us. Dr. Fraser, welcome.
Technology, it's working. Ha ha ha. Good, well, this is exciting, and I'm so very grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you today. Honor the students that we just saw coming across the table. I'm getting hungry. Coming across the stage. And then we can spend some time thinking about the topic that I've chosen today, which the title is When Too Much Isn't Enough. And hopefully the meaning of this somewhat obscure phrase will become clear as I work through my slides. Food systems, sustainability, and health is my theme. And another way of putting my talk is 3 counterintuitive trends and 3 possibly silly predictions. So you can keep count with me. 3 trends, 3 predictions. And of course, the first trend that any discussion of global food security has to start with is that of population growth. As we probably all know, the world's population is rising from its current estimate of somewhere around 7 billion, and it's reaching up towards that 9.5 or 10 billion mark later this century. And this is expected to put enormous stress on the world's ecosystems as we try to address the food security requirements of this growing number of people. Now, talking about population and food security has been around for hundreds of years. I could go back all the way to Malthus in the 1700s, late 1700s. But for the sake of this talk, I'd like to take you to 2008 as sort of the modern moment when I observed people starting to really seriously talk about global food security. And in 2008, none other than Professor Sir John Beddington, who was then the UK government's chief scientific advisor, gave a major policy address about food security. And here's how here's how the Guardian newspaper covered Professor Beddington's talk. The world faces a perfect storm of problems by 2030, and in particular, food and water shortages as a result of climate change and growing populations are likely to trigger mass migration and unrest. Unless, and the punchline of Professor Beddington's speech was, unless the world's farmers produce 70% more food by 2050. 70% is a contested number, but it's the most commonly used in the literature. To put this into a little bit of context, The Economist magazine reflected on Professor Beddington's talk and said this: in the next 40 years, humans will need to produce more food than they did in the previous 10,000 years put together. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not sure I agree with this statement, and I'm not sure I agree with this entire narrative around population growth, and I'll come back and tell you why in a minute. But before I do that, let's make no mistake. The last 10 years has been extremely challenging in terms of managing global food security. And Professor Beddington himself in 2008 was speaking at a particularly dramatic moment in the world's food system. We get a sense of the drama of the times by looking at this graph, which I have intentionally left blank for now, so I can just explain what the graph is about to show. It's a food price graph. The y-axis is the United Nations Food Price Index. It's a weighted average. It basically gives us a snapshot in time of how much food costs. Data goes back with the Food Price Index to the early 1990s. And when we see the data unfold, that's what we see. Flat, stable, low prices throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, and then a bit of a roller coaster. Professor Beddington himself was speaking right there. That was when that perfect storm speech was given. The argument is that unless we produce all this food, and like I said, I'll demolish the argument a little bit in a second, but the argument goes that unless we produce all this more food, this is the tip of the iceberg. We are into a period of time of high volatile food prices. And let's make no mistake, before I start criticizing the argument, let's make no mistake, this food price crisis is a crisis that's thrown tens, maybe 100 million people deeper into poverty. And we can get a sense of the nutritional implications of this crisis by looking at these two photographs. They come to us from the Institute for Development Studies, and they show how much food you could buy for $1 on a market in the African nation of Zambia. And this is how much food you could buy for $1 in 2007 before that price spike. So just pause for a second, look at the photograph. I think that you'll agree that it's not a bad supply of food. I think there's some dairy in the bottom left-hand corner. But critically, I'd like you to look at the center of this photograph, that bag of dried fish, that family's supply of protein. Well, here's how much food you could buy on the same market for the same amount of money 1 year later when food prices had risen. I don't think I need to say anything here. It's a tremendous burden facing high volatile prices for the world's poor and marginalized. So this is the nutritional implications of this crisis. This crisis also has political implications as well. And this map shows us, illustrated by the countries in red, where food riots occurred between 2008 and 2011. That's people taking violently to the streets in outraged protest over the price of their daily bread. Here's a photograph that I believe comes to us from Egypt on the cusp of the Arab Spring, which many people see now as having started through protests over food prices. And if you look closely, there's 1, 2, I think 3 French baguettes raised into the air as some sort of international sign of protest and outrage over an unfair food system that allows some to be stuffed while others starve. This photograph, I believe, comes to us from Haiti during their food riots that ultimately toppled the Haitian government in 2008. And again, if you look closely, you see the line of oncoming riot police and the lone protester holding the French baguette as a machine gun. And for those of you of a certain age, I'm reminded of that old Monty Python joke involving John Cleese and a banana. And I've got a couple of chuckles. Come on, be as vicious as you like. But let's pause for a second. Many people, like I said, Professor John Beddington, for instance, have looked at this crisis of the last 10 years and come to the conclusion that we need to produce more food. But let's pause, and instead of concluding we need to produce more, let's ask it as a question. If we produce more food, will that have any dramatic impact, for instance, on prices? Will anybody go to bed at the end of the day better fed if we produce more food? And when we ask it as a question, we can start collecting data, information, to try to test or answer that question. And at the global level, we have some supply data from the United Nations. So what's going to appear on this graph now is the world's food supply measured in calories per person per day. In 1990, according to the United Nations, there were 2,600 calories for every man, woman, and child on the planet. And this has trended steadily upwards. To the point in 2013, which is the last year for which data is available, there were 2,848, we'll round up to 2,850, why not? 2,850 calories for every person on the planet. Now, there's three things that I think we really have to pay attention to here. The first is the slope of the orange line, which is rising. Remember, this is food supply standardized for population growth. I mean, this is per person. And population growth has skyrocketed exponentially over this very time period, yet agricultural production has gone up faster. And this is because farmers have invested and embraced technologies. Now, we can discuss the social and environmental impacts of those technologies. Happy to discuss those critically and honestly. And we have to think very carefully that this is a huge accomplishment. We are producing more food now than at any point per person in human history. The second point that I think superimposing these two lines reveals is a lack of relationship between food price in the blue that goes up, comes down, goes way up, comes way down, goes way, way up, and food supply, which marches forward steadily. There is no evidence, at least at the global level in this data, to suggest that food supply will have any effect on food price. In other words, if food supply is increasing even more, there's no evidence here to suggest that will bring prices down or result in anybody better fed. And the third point that needs to be raised is the 2,850 number. For all of us who have any understanding of nutrition, that's more than enough calories for us all, suggesting that maybe this isn't a population issue and a production issue. Maybe this is a supply or an equity and a distribution issue. And to give this a bit more, give this argument a little bit more visual oomph, I'd like to introduce you to my personal favorite photo essay of all times. It's called The Hungry Planet by Peter Menzel and Faith DeLuzio, who are two journalists that traveled around the world a couple years ago. And they took formal family portraits where they posed each family with 1 week's worth of groceries. And in this way, they introduce us to the Revis family from North Carolina, who spend $86.15 per person per week on food. Whew. Wow. And of course, it invites the comparison with the Notomos family from Africa that spends $1.76 per person per week on food. And again, the pictures, I think, stand for themselves. So maybe this is an equity issue, not a production issue. Maybe this is a waste issue, not a production issue. We waste 1/3 of the world's food. And that's an impossible figure to wrap your head around. But Metro Vancouver has tried to bring that enormous leaky food system that wastes so much down to life. And here are some statistics from Metro Vancouver's webpage. In Metro Vancouver, we throw away 80,000 potatoes each day, 30,000 eggs, and 70,000 cups of milk. So maybe this is an equity issue. Maybe this is a waste issue. We also haven't talked about whether we're actually producing the right kinds of food. And I love this graph. I've presented it a number of times, so if anyone's heard me speak before, you've probably heard me speak to this graph. It's going to show you what the world should be eating, and in this case, I've chosen the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate model, which will appear on the left-hand side of the screen, versus what we're actually producing on the right-hand side. And we start with those fruits and vegetables that we all know we should be eating more of, 8 to 10 servings a day per person. Well, when I had a poor undergraduate student work her way through the entirety of the Food and Agriculture Organization data 2 summers ago, converting tons of carrots into dietary servings per person per day, she discovered that we actually chronically underproduce at a global level fruits and vegetables. There's only about 3.5 servings per person per day of fruits and vegetables. Those cereals and starches that nutritionally probably should be something like a fifth of our diet represent a whopping chunk, about half of the global food supply. And this is cereals and starches for human consumption. This is not livestock feed. This is not bioethanol. The FAO that collects this data is very clear on this fact. So we really overproduce cereals and starches. Oils and fats, we overproduce. Meats and alternatives, we probably produce about the right amount for current needs. Same with dairy. There's lots of debate happening about those, so I'm going to skip through that sort of controversial area and jump right to my punchline, which is the sugars that we all know we should be cutting back on represent a whopping chunk of the global food supply. So we come to this sort of analysis, and we can't help but realize that there's some sort of mismatch between what we know we should be eating and what we're actually producing. But buried in this is actually some really good news. Because a postdoc that I've been working with on this data has calculated that if the world actually produced the left-hand side of this graph, we actually had an agricultural system modeled more on the Harvard model, then we would save about 50 million hectares of land from agriculture. That's a big bonus for biodiversity, for carbon sequestration. So, where I want to go here now is one last time back to that food price graph. And remember, I started this part of my talk off talking about population growth, and I hopefully convinced you that maybe population growth wasn't a strong driver of food security, and maybe it was a bit of a red herring, and we really should be focusing on waste and equity and things like that. Well, there are things that are absolutely, without any doubt, drivers of the world food system. And we can see the shape of this food price line reflected in all sorts of different places in the financial pages of our newspapers on our websites. And that's because the food price line, at least since 2007, looks a startling a lot like the price of oil and the price of energy. And here you'll see a relationship that will make even the grumpiest statisticians smile and grudgingly agree that at least since 2007, there's a strong relationship. So I'd like to leave you with about my talk, the part of my talk that deals with population growth is the following. We've already got enough food, but we waste it. It's not particularly healthy, and it's not all that well distributed. So I don't think that just producing more to address population growth will mean that anybody is better fed. That was my first counterintuitive trend. My second counterintuitive trend is to spend a little bit of time talking about one of the 21st century's second boogeymen, which is climate change. And to set this part of my talk up, I'd like you to imagine sitting at a scientific search engine, Google Scholar, something like that, typing in those words, climate change, adaptability, vulnerability, and you'd very quickly come up with an image such as this one. This comes from a World Bank report, and it shows in the red where we expect climate change to cause crop yields to decline over the 21st century versus the areas in the green where crop yields may increase because they benefit from a longer growing season and more degree days or slightly better growing conditions. And it's the areas that I'm highlighting here in the yellow that I think should attract our immediate attention, because these are areas not only that are expected to decline, but they're also really, really important in terms of the global food system. These are our bread baskets. Now, I've spent a lot of my career working on generating these kind of outputs. I'll show you another one in a second. I wasn't involved in this particular one, but I find it illustrative. And for all the respect that I have and admiration I have for the scientific work that goes into calculating these projections, I actually have significant doubt as to whether or not this is an accurate projection of how the future will unfold. And the reason for that is quite simple. The reason for my skepticism is that I don't think that if you jumped into the 2030s or the 2040s and drilled into one of those red areas, you'd necessarily see the losses that are being projected, because the complicated equations that make these projections struggle to capture one of the most important factors that drive the food production equation. And that factor is the farmer, of course. So this is actually a photograph of me. I'm sitting on my grandfather's lap. It's about 1975. My brother and my cousins are in the back of the tractor. And I'm actually going to use this slide twice tonight. So this is because I want to tell you two stories about my grandfather's farm. So this is the first of my two parables from the Niagara Peninsula. And the first parable from the Niagara Peninsula is to tell you the story of a drought that hit this farm. And when I was about 17, we had a bad year. And my grandfather grew a lot of sweet corn. And the soil became so dry and crumbly that the sweet corn started to fall over because the roots couldn't hold on in the soil. And so Grandpa and I and another kid, we spent a week dragging irrigation pipes all over the farm. It was a pain in the ass. And then we spent about 3 days sort of carefully tiptoeing through the corn, which was about chest high at the time, holding each plant up, and either with our feet or a hoe, buttressed each plant with a little pile of soil. And then when I returned to help my grandfather harvest about a month later, I was amazed because we had adapted. The harvest was fine. That's the first drought. The second drought, however, happened about 10 years later, by which point I was working at the University of Toronto, doing my master's degree, living with my girlfriend in the annex. My grandfather was in his late 80s by that point. Chris Jeffs, the other kid, he was an electrician in Welland. That year, the soil became dry and crumbly, and the corn crop fell over, and there was no adaptive capacity. There was nobody there to pick the corn up and put it back on its feet, so to speak. The reason that this is an important story, and the lesson for this, is that the social context that the drought happened in was vital in determining the outcome of that drought. From a climate modeling perspective, like the kinds that generate that map that I showed you a few seconds ago, from that perspective, it was the same farm, it was the same soil, it was the same meteorology, it was the same crop. All those terms were the same. The farmer's actions determined the difference. So I'm now going to shift from the language of parable and metaphor and storytelling back into the language of science. And here's a piece of science that I worked on a few years ago that essentially makes the same point. You start with a complicated equation that says if you've got this kind of climate, this is how much crop you get. And you run that climate model to generate outputs. And the output that I'm going to show you on the y-axis is the percentage of harvests, and here we're talking about China's winter wheat crop. This is what this particular climate model is being run for. The percentage of harvests that are likely to fail, a term we define statistically, and I can handle that in the Q&A, but just it's a bad year, over the 21st century due to climate change. So we run the model a lot of different times, and we change the model slightly each time to capture things we don't fully understand. So we create a range of projections, and in a baseline scenario, we end up with an output like this, where that red line in the middle is the average of all these different model runs. The most pessimistic scenario is that top one near 40%, and the most optimistic scenario of the model is that bottom one. And the way to interpret this graph is to say, wow, if we don't do anything else, climate change could cause, 25% or so of China's winter wheat crops to be really, really, really bad. But then the scientific team that I was working with said, well, what if we simulated adaptation strategies? What if, for instance, farmers had access to heat-tolerant cultivars of wheat? Well, when we put those sort of assumptions into the model, climate change effect drops. Drops again when we imagine better irrigation systems or water adaptation. And when we imagine so-called perfect adaptation, we could convince ourselves the effect of climate change could go away entirely. The point that I'm making here is that the models that we use to simulate climate change don't tell us the future. They tell us about a range of futures. This particular model is giving us 4 futures, one of which, the one on the left, is quite terrifying from a global food security perspective. But the one on the right is totally benign. The world we end up in will be determined by what social decisions we make, what technologies we invest in, how we enable farmers. It's not determined. We're not locked into something. So my key message to you about climate change, and there's so much more we could talk about, but tonight my key message for you is this. Climate change, in my opinion, has the potential to be hugely significant, but we really don't have the tools to anticipate whether farmers will be able to adapt. And that's a major research gap, and I don't know if it's one that we will ever really satisfactorily nail. So that's my second trend. My third trend I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but I can't give a public talk without discussing a little bit about sustainability. The data on agriculture is utterly sobering, bordering on nihilistic and depressing. 1/3 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from the ag-food sector. Ag is the largest user of fresh water on the planet. It's the largest polluter of water on the planet. It's the largest driver of biodiversity loss on the planet. We have to, and I actually have a great deal of optimism, we are in the process of changing how we farm in order to change our relationship with the planet. And this point really hammered home to me a couple of years ago when I accompanied I helped lead a field trip with our 4th-year ag science students across the Midwest of North America. And on one of our stops, not far from, somewhere around Colorado, we stopped at a beef feedlot. And this is a place where cows are brought at about a year of age. They're fed an intensive grain diet for about 8 or 9 months or so, and then they're shipped to slaughter. And this particular feedlot was licensed to hold 100,000 animals at a time, so that's large but not enormous by North American standards. The kicker, though, was when I came to the end of the tour, and the bus turned at the end of one of those long alleys, and I snapped this photograph, which isn't a particularly good photograph, but it was the only one I could take because I wasn't really supposed to be taking photographs. And it was this that I want to draw your attention to, because that, ladies and gentlemen, is a 410,000-ton pile of manure. Now, that's a very large number to try to wrap your heads around, so I tried to convert it into adult elephants, being a fairly well-established standard unit in the scientific literature, and apparently it's about 38,000 adult elephants worth of poo. It's sitting unconfined and uncovered in the environment, and if you look closely at that green strip about 2/3 of the way to the horizon, that's a riparian zone, a river that we're slightly uphill from. So just think about that. 38,000 elephants worth of manure, slightly uphill from a river. Of course, this is a public health nightmare waiting to happen. But it shouldn't be, right? This should be a valuable source of soil nutrients, because agriculture doesn't have to be this sort of polluter and user and whatnot. It can have a very virtuous relationship with the universe, with the planet, with the environment, but only if we get our economic policies right. So we are in the process, I think, of undergoing a change, a growing up, if you will, of our relationship with the planet, and agriculture is at the front of that change. And I'll talk a bit about what that change is going to look like in a few seconds. Another area which I can't not talk about when talking about the challenge of feeding the future and the issue of sustainability is that of antibiotics. And of course, we all know that we are so overusing our primary tool in the fight against infectious diseases that our frontline antibiotics are no longer working as much as they used to. And I know this is an extraordinarily complicated issue, and I also know that at some level, agriculture plays a role. For instance, this data comes from the New England Journal of Medicine. It's a couple of years old, and it shows us where antibiotics are used in North America. It's probably familiar to most of you in this room, but the crops, the pets, and the aquaculture use a sliver of our antibiotics. Oops. Humans use about a quarter, and the rest goes into the livestock industry. Now, I am aware that I'm glossing over a tremendous amount of complexity about what kinds of antibiotics and how they're utilized, and there is a consensus in the literature that one of the causes of the rise of antibiotic resistance in this moment in history is animal livestock. Policy is attempting to address all of these issues, the water pollution, the greenhouse gas, and the antibiotic use. And we are in the process of changing how we do things, and we're going to do better in the next generation. So this brings me to the end of the first chunk of my talk. I said I would talk about 3 trends. I talked about population growth, I talked about climate change, and I talked about this sort of broad, nebulous thing called sustainability. This is the message I'd like you to take away. What we produce is food nutritious. How we produce it, sustainability. How food is distributed, equity. And how food is wasted, or how much food is wasted. All of these are more important than how much food we produce in terms of determining whether the future is actually well-fed or not. So that being said, as the first part of my talk, I now want to cast the gaze forward and make 3 you can make your own mind up, silly, outlandish, sensible, well-grounded predictions about where some of these momentum from these trends is actually taking us into the future. And my first prediction is that we are going to be eating new, lower input food products in the near future. I could think of no better way to illustrate this than a photograph of Sweet Earth's benevolent bacon that contains absolutely no bacon. Sweet Earth makes a line of non-meat protein products, and 2 weeks ago they were bought by Nestle. Pretty cool, hey? Earlier this year, actually 10 days ago, it was just 10 days ago, I was doing something with Michael McCain, the CEO of Maple Leaf Foods, Canada's hot dog king, and he said to me, the future is less but better quality meat, and Maple Leaf Food just bought Light Life, a plant-based protein company in the States. So, I use this as illustrative of the fact that there is a change happening in the kinds of food we're going to eat. Now, when most of us think of alternative protein, we frankly think of farmed salmon, and farmed salmon offers a lot of advantages. It can be produced with a lower environmental footprint. Its ability to convert feed into muscle is far superior to, say, mammals or especially beef. And so I think farmed salmon is definitely going to be in our future. But, and I know we've got a friend from the pulse industry here, so you'll be delighted to see my next slide. I think there was a range of alternative protein supplies that will become and are in the process of becoming dominant in our diets. And of course, the first is the pulses, those leguminous crops. But not restricted just to pulses. This is the logo of a UK company called Corn that makes a really good alternative meat product made of fungus. Or an algae drink or a sports drink rather, made of algae. Or, we do this before dinner, not after dinner. Oops, this is a very sensitive slide, keyboard. Edible insects, because what conversation is complete without a good discussion about crickets? All of these products have major environmental benefits potentially associated with them. So for instance, my friend that works on edible insects at the University of British Columbia tells me that crickets require 12 times less feed and 13 times less water than cattle, where pigs produce somewhere between 10 and 100 more greenhouse gas emissions per edible kilogram, as does mealworm. Corn's website makes the following claim. Corn causes 5 times less greenhouse gas emissions than beef and 1.5 times less than chicken. So, big environmental benefits by having a shift. But does this mean, and is my silly prediction for you tonight, that in Stanley Cup playoffs in the future we'll be saying no to beef jerky and hello to cheddar cheese larvettes, the original worm snack? Yeah, possibly. The mouthfeel wasn't delightful of the cheddar cheese larvettes. They were a little dry. When we shifted to the crickets, the way the legs got caught in your gums was a little disquieting. So I don't think the beef industry or Ben & Jerry's has anything to worry about just yet, but there are lots of places in our food system where these alternative protein supplies can become introduced. So for instance, I have friends at the University of Guelph that are working on using insects as a livestock feed and driving environmental benefits that way. Why not feed worms to salmon as opposed to feeding wild fish meal to salmon? Possible big sustainability benefits there. And this is a peanut butter and jelly cricket flour bar that I bought on my way out of the US at the Ronald Reagan International Airport, funnily enough. I was just about to board. I stopped to buy a snack to eat on the plane, and there was the Exo bar. I think that one of the things we can imagine, though, is that that food processing is changing radically. And what we have in this slide is a 3D printer designed to extrude alternative protein supplies. And I'm just going to let the inventor of this particular product speak for himself. The look of the worms put me off, but in the shape of a cookie, I'll eat it. And taste is quite culturally determined, really. I mean, we do have this idea that we're wedded to our chops and our nuggets, and that Revis family from North Carolina is never going to give up its diet in favor of crickets and mealworm. But I think that actually lacks imagination, and I mean that kind of seriously. And to buttress this point, I'd like to take you to December 1986. And I can date this with a high degree of precision. And the reason for that is, and the students that I was talking to are laughing because I went on this rant half an hour ago to you guys, so apologies for the repeat. I was staying up late. I was about 12, 13 years old. I was staying up late and I was watching Saturday Night Live. And Saturday Night Live came on with one of their mock commercials. And it was hilarious, and it introduced me to a food product that I thought was disgusting and hilarious and weird, and exactly the same reaction. I had exactly the same reaction to this food product as you just had to my cheddar cheese larvette slides. And it was McSushi, America's Eating It Raw. Now, the only evidence I can find of this sketch is this tiny, grainy, thumbnailed image from Saturday Night Live's archives. And it's not on YouTube. It's probably the only thing that Saturday Night Live has ever done that isn't on YouTube because it's not funny anymore. The joke wasn't on the sushi industry. It was on the lack of imagination of the Saturday Night Live writers, because within 10 years, McSushi was real. It was being sold in California. And it had gone from an object of late-night ridicule to an unexamined part of our food landscape in a bewilderingly short period of time. And I think we're actually on the same transition, and the Pulse guys are going to capitalize on this. And here's 2 photographs that I took in the last 12 months. And the photograph on the right is one of my, well, they're all the women in this photograph have taken undergrad classes with me. The one on the right, she's just finished a presentation on alternative protein and is handing out cricket flour brownies to the class. And the one on the left, the 2 young women have just won the University of Guelph's chili contest for their insect-based chili. And the fellow there is our Member of Parliament, Lloyd Longfield, who tweeted out later that day, "Interesting, add cloves and cinnamon to insect protein. Yum, sustainable food supply available anywhere. Bugs." So, my second prediction is that we'll be eating a lot more stuff that we might consider a little gross today. That's my first prediction. My second prediction is about farming. So I'm now going to pull this lens back away from the food end of the spectrum and put it back in the farming end of the spectrum. And we are on the cusp of a digital agricultural revolution. Agriculture 4.0 is coming. The same technologies that brought us the internet and are transforming medicine are just now at the beginning of being applied on our farms and in our barns. So this is the second story where I'm going to go back to that family photograph of me on my grandpa's tractor. And I loved that tractor. It was a great tractor. Classic Canadian-made Massey Ferguson vehicle. I spent a lot of time as a teenager standing on that back platform where my cousins and my brother are in this photograph. And my job was to have a bucket of fertilizer pellets on either side of me. And I would simply throw the fertilizer off the field. It just feels like riding a bike. I can do it all day. And Grandpa would drive slowly through the melons and the sweet corn, and I would throw fertilizer on. And that's how we fertilized our fields. And I'm going to say, with the benefit of hindsight and a PhD in farming and agriculture, I'm going to say that 50% of that fertilizer wasn't utilized by the plants. It didn't land at the right place at the right time. It worked its way into the water table and found its way into Lake Erie, where it fed an algae bloom, or it got trapped in an anoxic environment and went up into the air as methane or one of the nitrous oxides or whatnot, and it contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, the modern tractor, for as much as I feel romantic and nostalgic for my afternoons throwing fertilizer, chatting with my grandfather, the modern tractor is totally different. The modern tractor, do a combination of technologies, doesn't look at a field as a field. A modern tractor looks at a field as a series of different management units pictured here. So because of big data and artificial intelligence, that tractor accumulates a knowledge, and I use that word in air quotations very deliberately, a knowledge of the field, and because it's high-precision GPS tools, because of these onboard dashboards, increasingly driverless technologies, and what they call variable application rate fertilizers and seeders. In other words, fertilizers or seeders that have multiple seed bins on them. That tractor knows where it is in the field and puts the right seed in the right place and gives it the right amount of fertilizer with no waste. Same thing's happening in the livestock industry. So what we have in this photograph is a robotic milker. You can just barely see the cow's legs under there. The pens where she lives are on the other side of this. And twice a day, she wanders quite willingly, of her own volition, into the milker. Her RFID tag, radio frequency identification tag, is red. The cups go on, or the arms come out and attach to the teats. Her life history is red. Her medical history is red. She's detected for any sort of anomalies, slight fluctuations in viscosity or conductivity or temperature in the milk that might be an early indicator of mastitis, et cetera, et cetera. She's given a bit of a ration, and she's sent on her merry way. The promise of these technologies is nothing less than more food on less land with fewer inputs. And it's all being unlocked because of robotics, sensorics, big data analytics. The same sort of thing is happening at the genetic level. Controversially, yes, absolutely. But even stepping away from topics like GM, which I'm going to deliberately avoid unless people ask me questions about it in the Q&A, even stepping away from GM technologies, there's all sorts of genomic technologies that people would probably all agree that have a really important place. For instance, the fellow here is Professor Paul Hebert. He's probably my most illustrious colleague at the University of Guelph. He's a towering giant in the field of ecology and biodiversity conservation because he developed a technology about 15 years ago called DNA barcoding that allows you, with a very small sample, to be able to quickly, inexpensively identify what kind of species is in that sample. Well, we are now using DNA barcoding as a way of identifying food fraud. So all that horse meat in the European horse meat scandal, all that mixed up meat that was in the sausage story from earlier this year, that was all identified using genomic technologies like DNA barcoding. Tracking invasive pests, tracking foodborne ailments can all be done much more inexpensively because of technologies like DNA barcoding. High-end genomic technologies devoted towards making the food system safer and more transparent. Another example of using genomic technologies as a force of good. Here's my colleague Bonnie Mallard, who won the Governor General's Innovation Award this year. Bonnie has a tool that allows her to identify cows with an inherently more robust immune system, and then is able to breed that trait into our breeding stock. As a result, immunity plus cows, as Bonnie calls them, have less diseases and require much fewer antibiotics. It's a traditional traditional animal breeding technique using advanced genomic screening technologies in order to figure out which cows have a natural ability to fight off diseases, and using that as a way of creating an animal breeding program. And all of this is possible because farming is collecting a huge amount of data. This is a figure from 2 years ago. This is the amount of data that came off Ontario farms in 1 year. It would fill about 1 million laptop computers. Since this data is 2 years old, and I've been told with good authority that this doubles every other year, we're probably talking about close to a million terabytes of data from Ontario farms alone. And this data are being aggregated and analyzed in a way to push forward an agenda and a set of technologies that will allow us to produce, like I said a few minutes ago, more food on less land with fewer inputs. So my second prediction to you tonight is that we will see a rapid acceleration of the utilization of digital technologies in our food system. My third prediction, though, is that not everyone's going to be all that excited with this. And people are going to be saying, wait a sec, 3D printed, artificial engineered bug protein? No thanks. That global food system is big, it's bad, it's impersonal, it's bearing down on us, and it's wiping out traditional cultures, it's wiping out artisanal foods, it's wiping out regional identities. No, thank you. And people are going to look at this advance of these systems that I'm talking about, and they're going to say, that's not the food system I choose. And so there's going to be a backlash, which I'm going to characterize as a local food backlash, but that's just my shorthand. People are going to react against the global food system by citing things like the drought in California from a couple of years ago. Well, that drought in California was especially galling and damaging to Canadians because we have, frankly, stopped producing a lot of fresh vegetables in our province, import a lot from California. Well, as prices rose because of the Californian drought, it happened at a time when our Canadian dollar was weak because of the price of oil. And as a result, we had dramatic food price inflation in 2015. Cauliflower, celery costing $7. The price of a healthy meal was rising out of the reach of even wealthy Canadians, let alone economically marginalized ones. So people are indeed working actively on finding an alternative to this sort of vulnerability. That local food system is seen by many, as an alternative. People will look at the global food system with its extraordinary specialization and economies of scale and say, I would rather a system that has more diversity into it. Give me a local food system, thank you. And they'll look at those modern tractors, and this is my favorite tractor. It's the new Case International Harvester tractor. It's got more horsepower than anything has a right to have, and there's no cab. There is no place for a human being to sit in the new Case IH tractor. And kind of me gets excited, and the other part of me is like, damn, if my grandpa had that, I'd never have had a summer job. So many people, myself included, say that many of these technologies are probably going to spell a decline in the quality of our rural communities. And that makes me sad. And so my other prediction is that we'll see a backlash. And we're already seeing that backlash. Oh, sorry, this is just my throwaway slide. This is a cidery that just opened last year down the road from my cottage. And I've jogged past this cider orchard all of my life. And it's not my favorite cider, but I buy it just because I like knowing that I can eat the apples on my jog in the summer at the cottage. But that backlash, I'm starting to see notes of that backlash. So 18 months ago, I wrote this article for the Guardian newspaper. I didn't choose the headline for the article, the editor did, but it went automated farming, good news for food security, bad news for job security. And I felt, at least this is what I told myself when I wrote the article, that I was providing a balanced, nuanced sort of assessment of these issues. But of course, it provoked a set of commentary, as articles like this sometimes do. And one person wrote in saying that the brave new world of automated farming that I was talking about is an extension of the current efficient Western scientific concept, and it generally takes the form of large-scale monocultures that have played havoc with soil fertility and biodiversity. The continuation of this type of blinkered high-tech domination of nature is not to be celebrated, and in fact, it's to be feared. Another comment that I got, farming took a wrong turn at the time of the Industrial Revolution and has never recovered. The next revolution will be a return to an expansive plethora of smaller-scale polymath, demanding artisanal skills and producing high-quality food for all. There will be an increase rather than a decrease in employment on the land and a resultant overall improvement in human health. And I think it's worth saying, yeah, I kind of agree with those perspectives. I kind of like that big bad Case International Harvester tractor because the The tech geek in me gets excited by the sleek red lines, but yeah, we are at risk of something here, aren't we? And so my third prediction to you is that some of us, some of the time, will go to that local farmer's market as a result of our disquiet with the trends of society. And in the global south, which I haven't talked about tonight, and I'm happy to discuss, because that's another very important issue, but for another lecture perhaps. In the global south, I think this disquiet will catalyze or coalesce around organizations like La Via Campesina, which is an international peasant movement geared around, for lack of a more eloquent way of putting it, bringing power away from the transnational systems that drive the global economy, food economy, and embedding that power more directly in the hands of small-scale producers. And so as I sort of wrap the second chunk of my talk up, I'm going to try to summarize my predictions. And I think that we're going to see a decline in some key areas of the current ag-food system. And I just hasten to add or make clear, these are my tea leaf predictions. This isn't a world I'm lobbying for. This is the world I just have a feeling we're moving into. And I think that issues like that 2008, 2011 food price crisis that sparked those riots I began my talk with, issues like the 70,000 cups of milk wasted each day in Vancouver, issues like those are really causing us at a policy level and at a consumer level to think, okay, we have to be doing things a little differently here. And we're probably going to see a decline in conventional livestock production. And I say this with all respect to my great many friends, neighbors, colleagues who are working in the livestock sector. I love beef and ice cream. I love steak, and I don't want to imagine a future without them. But I don't think we are going to be eating those sort of products in the same volume that we have for the last 20 years, especially in North America. And I think that system, as we see declines in some elements of that system, we're going to see big increases, really big increases in farmers that adopt those precision agricultural, Ag 4.0, digital agriculture, whatever label you want to put on it, technologies. And that goes all the way from the farm field, pictured here, through to the food processor and the consumer, such as that 3D printer. And at the same time as I am predicting large-scale growth in that kind of system, I think we're going to see growth, but smaller growth in that alternative local system. And so for me, those are the predictions which I would like to leave you with today. I'm going to talk for a very small number of minutes because I would be a very bad corporate employee of the University of Guelph if I didn't take a moment to do a little bit of bragging, describing the exciting things that are going on at the place that we like to know as, we like to call ourselves Canada's Food University. And we've had a hell of a year at Canada's Food University. We've actually, and I have found myself in the bizarre position of playing a leadership role in writing a series of grants that have brought in an excess of $100 million in the last 12 months. Partly this is funded through Canada's First Research Excellence Fund, Food from Thought, and partly it's funded through the Aral Food Institute, where we're really trying to, both from a scientific and technological perspective, but also a social and policy perspective, take a serious look at how we can do farming better, utilizing the tools of big data and artificial intelligence, and hopefully harnessing it as a force for good. I'm putting this slide up to illustrate two things. One, that we're working with a lot of partners, and I get in trouble with my boss if I don't put the slides up, but also to illustrate that we're open for collaboration. So for those faculty members out there who may be thinking of collaborating on the topic of food and sustainability, we are open for business and would love for there to be a shorter drive or a more communication between the University of Toronto and the University of Guelph. And for those of you who are students, I actually have $2 million a year to spend on graduate students for the next 10 years, which is just a weird thing to say. I've been scraping, change out of the mattresses and the couch to keep my grad students going for years, and now we're sort of awash in cash. So if you're interested in doing a grad degree, let us know. And one of the things that I'm really having fun with is because we've got this large cohort moving through, I'm able to offer students an opportunity where they don't have to do TA-ships. They don't have to mark first-year stats, and they can instead work for me at the Aral Food Institute. And so what we've got here is a group of students that we're workshopping on projects. And this year I've got 18 students, 4 teams. We spent September workshopping topics and groups, and now all the groups are working with community partners on projects. So they're enrolled in their theses, they're working with their supervisors, they're doing their degree requirements, and instead of marking undergrad statistics, you get to work with me on a community-oriented project, and it's a lot of fun. Other elements of this initiative, we've got policy fellowships, we've got opportunities for undergrads to be involved through something that I run called the Feeding 9 Billion Challenge, and we've even got some opportunity to create startups and also social enterprises. And so we're really putting a heavy emphasis on getting our research into the real world and creating opportunities for students to get their research into the real world. And finally, the last thing I'll say by way of this infomercial for the University of Guelph, Canada's Food University, is that thanks to the generosity of Tony and Ann Errol and the Errol Family Foundation, we've got a major conference. It'll be May 22nd to 24th of next year. The day of the 24th, the third day, will be at the Four Seasons in Toronto. Charles Godfrey's, Daniel's somewhere here. I can't see Daniel. Charles Godfrey's is one of our keynotes, so you could reconnect with Charles if you wanted to. And at the conference, we're going to be announcing the winners of 2 Food Innovation Awards. So one of the Errol family's interests was to create a food equivalent of the Gairdner Awards. And so it'll be 2 $125,000 awards, one for research and one for contributions at the community level. I stuck my oar in that one and said we can't just reward science, we have to reward contributions at the community level. And so the nomination portal is open now, and so I'm on a road trip trying to convince people to put nominees forward for the first inaugural Errol Family Foundation Food Innovation Award, one for community and contributions and one for research contributions. And with that being said, I think I will simply wrap up, and thank you for your kind attention. If anybody's interested, that's how you can track me down. And I believe we're going to do a Q&A. I'm happy to do a Q&A. Thank you very much.
Hi, Dr. Fraser. Oh, sorry.
That's
Is it too
right.
loud?
You're good.
Cool. So after listening to your presentation, I feel really excited to see like a professor with such a passion about like food securities. And I'm also one of those people who is looking into a solution for our current food securities too. Recently, I'm researching about vertical farming, especially aquaponics, which literally fits in to the topic of adaptation, sustainability, and also like the meeting the gaps between the supply as well as the demand, especially in urban settings. So in here, I would like to make a prediction and also want your comment about this. I will predict if vertical farming technologies become more developed and efficient, local food movement is gonna be a very important thing to help us to overcome this food security problem, especially if we have vertical farms set up in urban settings, for example, like Toronto. That is my question.
That's good. It's a good question, and you may be very interested to learn then that I think it was in September of this year, a vertical farm company called True Leaf broke ground for a 60,000 square foot vertical farm in Guelph, just off the 401. And they're producing green leafy vegetables. They're expecting to be producing by springtime. The building's going up really fast. I just drove past it a couple days ago. And they're expecting to be, or they've got contracts with Gordon's Food Services and with Loblaws. And so, yeah, the technology is happening. It's happening quickly. So, but there's always a but, or there's always an and, or there's always some complexity here. A couple of things that I would caution about enthusiasm for vertical farms. And I share a lot of enthusiasm for vertical farms, but I don't necessarily know it's a food security strategy. I think vertical farms offer us the potential, at least when the technology is realized, to do a small amount of high value added, maybe micronutrient dense products. I think they will generate a very small amount of very good quality protein, but I don't think they're going to make the food system more resilient or more equitable, except in perhaps, and there's one context where I think there is a large amount of interest in this, in northern remote communities, which potentially, especially when you start talking about LED lighting systems, offer communities the opportunity that maybe have no opportunity to import, or it's very expensive to import, the opportunity to produce their own vegetables. And I hold out hope that that sort of technology, say in remote indigenous communities or First Nations communities, there will be a role, but then you also have to be thinking, is that appropriate technology in remote, northern Ontario communities? But I've been on a few remote communities in the Yukon recently, and people had invested a lot of effort in building greenhouses, but they weren't particularly efficient greenhouses using particularly good greenhouse technology. So I think in that context there could be a real food security gain, but I have a feeling in Toronto or in Guelph, vertical farming will produce a high-value crop, a crop that is great for consumers, but I don't necessarily know if it'll address sort of food security in a sense.
Thank you very much for your very interesting, engaging talk. My question is a curiosity regarding your prediction for how the issue of equity and food distribution, and what your thoughts are on whether there are aspects of how to increase equity from a research perspective, in terms of what kind of questions do we need to ask, or is it just about finding solutions from a sort of operational perspective?
So we've been talking about this with Valerie and her lab all this afternoon. This is an issue that comes up a lot, and you're I think zoning in on what I consider one of the most challenging issues. That when we look at, say, food insecurity in Canada, or households that are food insecure or whatnot, I don't think addressing those or trying to, quote, fix that problem, although that's a terrible way of expressing it, but addressing that problem, it's not a food-related problem. I mean, it's an income distribution problem, it's a living wage problem, it's a set of social issues linked with colonialism and our settler legacy. It's a mental health issue, it's a drug addiction issue. There's very little food insecurity in Canada, in my opinion, and in reading the statistics. So I think it's really important to be working on food. I'm devoting my life to working on food. But I don't think that the work that I'm doing addresses food insecurity, which is defined as the inability to access food in a society. We're working on trying to create a more resilient, more robust, more equitable, more socially literate society. And those are all good things. Those are all things I'm passionate and committed to. But they're not going to result in that 4 million Canadians who some point in the year cannot access food for one reason or another. That's not. It's a different set of issues, and because I feel that they're really rooted in social problems more than anything else.
Hi. Sorry. So my question has to do with all the great technology that you spoke about in terms of farming. Do you think that technology will be more accessible to farmers in the first world? And what do you think would happen to farmers in more third world countries? Will they also have access to those technologies due to affordability?
So that's a great question. All right. Echoey. That's a really, really important question because technologies are always developed in a social context. And the further you move away from that social context that technology is developed in, the less effective, generally, that technology is. So one of the problems that the Green Revolution ran into was it was largely technologies that worked and delivered on their promise in the American Midwest and in Canada. And as soon as you applied them in a small-scale farming context, they didn't really work very well. that's a contested statement, and we can debate that, but I think in general. So to answer your question, I'm going to tell you the story of a friend of mine, and this is another parable, which I think illustrates it. And the guy's name is Manesh Rizada, and he's a plant scientist, and he uses GM technologies to figure out how, or create versions of corn that can better utilize nitrogen. And that's Manesh's mainstream scientific thing. And a number of years ago now, he was invited to Nepal to help boost yields, where yields were really low. And as he told me the story, he went to Nepal expecting to use GM technologies to improve the genetics of millet, in this case. And he quickly discovered, though, that the farmers in Nepal, who were all women in this area, were using what they called broadcast seeding. Essentially, like me on my grandpa's farm, just throwing handfuls of seed. And Manesh said, well, that's crazy. If you plant in rows, evenly spaced rows, you get a huge yield boost, and demonstrated that you could increase yield by 50% simply by planting in rows. And then the women pushed back, and they said, I mean, I'm imagining what they said. I have no idea what they said. But I can imagine they're like, yeah, come on, dude. I've got kids to get to school. I've got chores to do. I got to get all the way up to that stupid terrace, a 20-minute walk away from my house. And then millet's it's the size of a pinhead, right? So, planting in even-spaced rows, I mean, come on. I'm going to get up there, I'm going to throw the things down, I'm going to get back down to my house and do what I need to do. And so they went back and forth a few times, and they ended up with a workshop, and they developed a technology, and it was 2 sticks and a string to mark a line in the sand, and a planter. It was nothing more in its first generation than a waist-high straw with a cup on the end, so you could sort of drop the seed in without having to bend over all the time. And that was the technology that they co-produced, the scientist and the farmer. And for me, the parable, or the message in this parable, is all about the process of how you develop science and apply it. And we have tremendous capacities with our digital technologies, unbelievable capacities. And this is not a but statement or an or statement, and we need to be working with the end users, especially in contexts that are distant from the University of Guelph or the University of Toronto. We have to be working in partnership with end users in order to develop and apply that technology. And that may take us in entirely different directions than we as scientists expected when we walked into the setting, like Manesh's started with GM and ends up with 2 sticks and a string. And that's the sort of message that we need to be getting into our heads as academics and thought leaders, is that we have to focus more on the process than the product. And if we do that, then maybe we can harness these extraordinary technologies that we're developing as a force of good.
Thank you very much. You've brought to mind some interesting ideas. I actually have 2 questions. One I think is easy. If the price of food is tied to the price of oil, and oil is related to climate change and greenhouse gases, how do we solve that part? Is agriculture becoming more energy efficient? And the second question is, if the Syrian civil war and the Arab Spring were caused by famine or triggered, but there were certainly other causes, and in that region, I don't see how you can improve the conditions of because they're getting hotter and drier. And so what do you see happening that could relieve that?
So 2 really good questions. Thank you for that. So, I mean, with regards to your first question, a statement and then an answer, there's no question in my mind that one of the key changes over the last 10 years has been that food markets and food prices have become more synced with energy prices and energy markets than ever before. And there's a number of reasons for that. One being that energy is a major input into farming, and so the cost of inputs rise, and so does that. But a second reason has to do with the sort of financial instruments and the ways that investors are using food as a hedge against inflation and making very large investments in food as a financial instrument, which is bringing the financial market and the food market together in a fairly lockstep way. And if you're interested, there's a prof at the University of Waterloo named Jennifer Clapp who has written extensively on this. And everything that I know about this, I get off of Jennifer Clapp. And it's the financialization of commodity markets is what Jennifer writes about. So I recommend you looking that up. The answer, though, to your question is what do you sort of do about this? And I think that, if we could figure out a mechanism to create a carbon price and apply it to the food system, much like in British Columbia, they've got a carbon levy attached to gasoline prices, and then you use the revenues from that policy and you reinvest in low-carbon forms of agriculture, specifically proteins, because proteins are the really most energy-intensive products we're consuming. I think you will see a radical acceleration of innovation, and the free market will do it. We will get there. We will have the Michael McCain's and the Maple Leaf Foods producing a really good quality soy burger that actually tastes good and competes well. And this is why people like Bill Gates have been betting on things like the Impossible Burger, and there's Memphis Meats, and all sorts of interesting innovation in the broad area of alternative proteins, because people are expecting there to be huge markets as soon as we start paying for the carbon that's embodied in our products. So I hold out some optimism in that one. The second question you asked is about that complex Gordian knot of relations mitigated through farming that includes environment and leads to state breakdown. And boy, that's a complicated one. And I'm really glad that you changed your language when you asked the question from cause to trigger, because famine and like a drought is never a cause of a civil war. But drought in combination with unplanned urbanization and already existing ethnic tensions and political corruption and an unemployed youth, at that point, then a drought can trigger this situation to go from a very unpleasant equilibrium into a chaotic phase. And we see that throughout history. French Revolution happened on the back of El Nino-induced droughts that brought people into the streets of Paris. Marie Antoinette did not say, "Let them eat cake," but we remember her saying, "Let them eat cake," as an apocryphal reference to that period of time, which reminds us of the food origins of that particular state breakdown. Syrian civil war, Rwandan genocide, Arab Spring. There's lots of examples through history of situations where bad weather caused harvest failures, and that triggered all the other problems that were happening in society to come to the surface. But you're not. I mean, if you're interested, if you identify that the environmental link and the food link there is the trigger, not the cause, then the solution has to do with urban employment and political corruption and the rule of law and transparency and the tools of democracy, says the misty-eyed liberal. It's those areas that you want to do, and actually going down a food and environment angle is actually a bit of a red herring, because it's a trigger, it's not a cause.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser. Really enjoyed your view here on food security, and the question that I have is with respect to climate change and population increase, and how that relates to the view on genetic modification. There is a lot of negativism across the globe with respect to GMO. However, there is certainly a lot to be gained from genetic modification. How do you think that will play out?
So the GM question always comes up, no matter how hard I skirt it in my talks. So thank you. Boy, it's a complicated one. In one regard, I have this feeling that the popular debate around GM is reflecting scientific debates of 10 years ago. And gene editing, marker-assisted breeding, these are much more sophisticated, nuanced genomic technologies that have some of the problems associated with, that the public associates with genetic modification, which is often just a code for transgenic, which means bringing the DNA from one species into another and then propagating the resulting modified organism. frankly, you can do plant breeding and animal breeding, genetic improvement, if you want to use that phrase, faster and more efficiently using other genomic selection tools where you stay within that same species. So you go through that field and you identify that species or that individual of corn that's drought resistant. You sequence the genome, you find the allele that's responsible for it, and then you use CRISPR-Cas9 and dump that gene expression into the next generation. Because you can turn on, with CRISPR, you can, we're still talking slightly hypothetical, but not that hypothetical. You can turn on and off the expression of alleles. And that essentially accelerates the speed at which you do plant breeding, thousands-fold. And I have a feeling that that's the technology that we're going to be talking about from this point forward. It's not this, oh, let's grab a spider gene and put it into an eggplant and try to get something. That's unbelievably clumsy. And to be honest, we've used that technology since the 80s, that kind of transgenic technology since the 80s. My reading of the literature, trying to be as objective as I can, is that there's still no good evidence of human health impacts of that. And frankly, if I'm going to be worried about something involved in the food chain and human health, I would work on fat and starch and carbohydrate and sugar way before I'd work on GM. There's evidence that there are environmental effects, but it's not linked very clearly to the transgenic nature of those organisms. It's generally linked to how farmers use the tools. And then and then where there are, I think, serious concerns is who's benefited from those technologies. And I think transgenic technologies has really benefited a small number of corporations, has provided a modest, at best, benefit to farmers and society writ large. There is a case to be made there. So for me, I'm a little frustrated with the GM debate because I think that major elements of it are not well founded in evidence. I think that some elements of the GM critique are well-founded in evidence, but we're not focusing on those elements, and that really the scientific frontiers are eclipsing those debates very, very rapidly, and we need to be talking about gene editing and genomic selection tools where there are similar, especially about the benefit question, right? Who's going to benefit from CRISPR-Cas9 is a really good question to ask. Is it just going to be a small number of corporations, or is there widespread benefit to that? And that's the debate that I would like us to have, rather than a question as to whether herbicide-resistant, Roundup-ready canola is good or bad for human health, because I think we're wasting our energy on that debate.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're trying to draw it to a halt. Last question, so you can bring us in the last questions. Oh, wait a sec, so right there, sorry, I beg your pardon. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I was pointing at you, but you already had the microphone. I apologize.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser, for the inspiring talk. My question is about hidden hunger. More than 2 billion people in the world are affected by malnutrition and micronutrient deficiency, especially in the developing countries. Your predictions and your suggestions to address this issue.
Gosh, well, sounds like the way you asked that question, it sounds like you should be answering it. All these issues of the hidden burden of these things are so hard to handle from a public policy perspective because of their very nature, right? Because they're hidden and they are the most marginal, generally affecting the most marginal members of society. And by definition, the most marginal members of society are the least likely to benefit from any sort of policy intervention that we've got. So I do not have an adequate answer to that extremely important question that you're asking. What I will raise as for me the challenge that this has is I think the issue of whether it's hidden hunger or disappearing daughters or the food insecure in Canada is that in many regards it feels like we're paying the consequences of 30 years of a social experiment involving wage inequality and the ratcheting up of the wealth of the most wealthy and the relative stagnation of the relatively poor. And I think that a large number of those issues that we're talking about or that you're raising relate in some way, directly or indirectly, to wage inequality and wealth inequality, and nothing that I'm working on in my career is really addressing that issue at all. Sorry. Sure, so there's lots of ways of gender inequality and wages. There's lots of different dimensions to that, but yeah. All right.